Okay, welcome back everyone. I hope you enjoyed the workshops. My name is Eleanor Davey. I'm a historian. I work at the University of Manchester, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this session, which is focused on the 1960s and 1970s. Now, this is the first of the so-called witness seminars for the conference, which means, as you'll see in the program, that it includes a number of people who are Save the Children alumni, as the term goes, although I know that the workshops have also involved people kind of speaking from that capacity as well. And I thought, thinking about our previous panel in the plenary session about the positions of the speakers, it's something that, of course, campuses are very aware of. We're having a lot of debates about our different positionalities, but it struck me that as much as who we are, we also need to talk about how we speak. So you'll see already we don't have a representative panel in terms of the events that we're discussing, but I hope that we are able to give space to different voices in the way that we talk about these issues, and you'll see that we have kind of different perspectives coming in from our speakers, both in terms of how they might illuminate the experience of Save the Children as an organisation, and how we might look beyond Save the Children and indeed beyond the aid sector and beyond those kind of organisational questions in thinking about the period that we're focusing on. So you have bios in the program. You might need to check the online program as well for updates. I won't labour the bios at length, but just to give you a sense of who you'll be hearing from. We're delighted to have John Seaman on this panel. He's in the centre there. He has worked for Save the Children in Biafra, Bangladesh, and the Sahel in the 1970s, and remaining at Save the Children, led organisationally and beyond on questions of medical and health work, livelihoods thinking, and international policy. He's now a research fellow at the University of Reading. We also have Mike Aronson on the far end. He worked in Nigeria for Save the Children as well, spent 16 years in the diplomatic service before returning to Save the Children, and is also engaged in this combination of organisational and wider sectoral discussions about advancing humanitarian thinking and health policy. He's now a visiting professor at the University of Surrey and Director Emeritus there. Just immediately to my right here we have Sammy Kent, who's a journalist and radio producer, a documentary maker, and he'll be speaking today, at least in part off the back of his experience making the radio documentary Britain and Biafra 50 years on, which I warmly recommend to you. I had a listen over the weekend and definitely worth catching up on if you haven't already heard it. He's now working for the Today programme on BBC 4. And further along we have Marie-Louise Desgrandchamps, who is a historian who works on the period that we're focusing on today, with an initial specialisation in the relief effort during the Nigerian Civil War, and now moving into research on the beginnings of the Red Cross movement in Africa, and she's a lecturer in modern history at the University of Geneva. So I'm going to sit down now for most of the panel. I'll pop back up so I don't miss people doing questions later on. But I'd like to start with Marie-Louise for the first question. We did cover some of these issues in the previous plenary panel, but just to keep it fresh in our minds, if you could give a sense of what was the situation facing aid agencies by the late 1960s, and what picture should we really be thinking about in terms of their networks and their operational capacities at this time?
Thank you very much, Eleanor. I don't want to come back too much on the broad context of aid as we talk about it a lot this morning. And of course, at the end of the 60s, the decolonization framework and the post-colonial framework was still very important for the relief organization. And the kind of colonial culture was still very present among them. But I think it is still important to emphasize one or two things regarding the way they will start their operation in Biafra. Maybe the first thing is that most of them, during this period, they didn't have a strong operational capacities. Okay, so this is very, I think, very, very important, and this explains some of the difficulties they faced during the conflict. And the second thing that is important is that there was no coordination mechanism among the relief organization, and so the main organization who was identified as a potential coordinator for international relief operation was the International Committee of the Red Cross at this period. But what is interesting is that even within the international movement of the Red Cross, which gathered together the League of the Red Cross Societies and the national societies and the ICRC, even within this movement, the role of coordinator of the ICRC was disputed, and it was not something recognized. Well, it was recognized, but it was it's often created tension between the different actors. So we can imagine how complicated it was to impose this role for other organizations. And maybe another thing that I want to point out quickly is that we emphasized that this morning that the relief organization had some difficulties to find their place between late colonial states or colonial government and national liberation movement. And I think that what is important also to recall regarding the Biafran conflict and then also the Bangladesh conflict is that in these cases the relief organization had to deal directly with independent authorities which had gained their sovereignties a couple of years ago, and this was also quite different. It was, even though the post-colonial rivalries between former colonial powers were still very important, but the relief organization, they had to deal mainly with independent authorities, and this was something also a little bit different.
Thank you. Sami, I'd like to turn to you now. If you could just give us a sense of, beyond the aid organization sort of focus, what was the portrayal of these former colonies, perhaps a wider third world, as it might have been in the language of the time? What was the image that we saw of those countries in the British media at that moment?
Well, I think the first thing to point out, and from the research I did, is actually there's painfully little attention paid to much of what was known as the Third World. There's a program from the BBC in the early 60s called The Inheritors, all about the various states in West Africa that are about to become independent or have just become independent. And the knowledge that it assumes on the part of the audience is really, really very little. Where these places are, how they live, whether they go to dance halls, things like that. I think it's easy to forget when you study a region, when you're really into it, that actually, for people living in Britain, they thought very little about, how Africans lived compared to how much Africans may have had to think about what Britain did. And I suppose that is a benefit of being kind of a winner of history. But part of that, if there was coverage, to do with that, how do they live? It was quite almost zoological, kind of, it was very othering, very interested in what they saw as backward traditions, cannibalism, and the part of the British in getting rid of or eradicating those practices. Beyond that, when you get to decolonization, there is, I think, both a sense of nervousness and also of hope. And nervousness to do with those, what they saw as backward traditions, that there was some awareness that these states were in some way fragile, that they might be vulnerable to various pressures, internal and external. There's part of that program called The Inheritors, where they say our impact on the minds of Africans is quite open to question. As hard as they had tried to kind of civilize their subjects. But there was also a great hope, and I think this is quite also hard to kind of think back to, kind of looking past the decades that have happened since. In the 1960s, in kind of academic circles, but also in the media as well, Africa was a bit the coming continent. Nigeria was talked of as a regional powerhouse. somewhere like Kenya was a wealthier country than Korea. I've done a program about Zambia, which had a unofficial but still fairly significant space program in the 1960s. There was a sense that this was a continent that was going places. And so for the British too, there was a strand of thought that kind of wanted to be a part of that and saw the Commonwealth as a kind of next project for Britain, especially in kind of like conservative British thought. And obviously it was in our interest too to portray that hope, portray that strength in some sense, because it justified colonialism not just as a exploitative, but as something worth having had done.
With legacies that,
exactly.
that were hopeful as well. Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to ask both John and Mike the next couple of questions, which is sort of in that setting, where were you in the mid to late 1960s, and how did you come into the aid work that I mentioned in the introduction? What brought you into working in Save the Children, or perhaps if you had other kinds of engagement before that? So perhaps, John, you could start us off.
Okay, I mean, for me, it was very simple. I'd qualified in medicine, wasn't quite sure what to do. I got a job lined up in pathology at the London Hospital. Pathology is always useful, whatever you want to do. Hadn't got any money, rang the BMA, which ran a locum service. It was done to my last 1 and 6pence. And just as sort of afterthought, they mentioned, oh, I got this job 3 months in Nigeria. So I phoned, I was recruited on the telephone. I kept explaining how I had insufficient experience, the voice on the other end. Actually, Major Fonseca kept saying, yes, but you are medically qualified, aren't you? 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a huge dining room at the Federal Palace Hotel on my own on Christmas Day, eating a turkey with the waiters in funny hats. Simple as that.
The picture that Sami described, do you recognise that image of sort of British awareness of a wider world?
Oh, absolutely, yes, because I can remember I was working in house jobs and you didn't get much time to see the telly, but we had a telly in the common room and it was dominant, so I was well aware of it. Now, at the time, I had no thoughts that I would get involved. It was a pure accident. Well, say accident, I mean, it's not an uncommon thing. I was partly brought up in West Africa, and I suppose there's always this lingering feeling that you want to go back, you want to see where you came from. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think my story is probably even more random than John's. I was at university between 1966 and 1969, didn't have a clue really what I wanted to do afterwards. But I had been touched by, there was a lot of very good journalistic reporting in the British press about the Biafran conflict. I remember particularly Colin Legion's reports in The Observer. And I remember sitting at university reading the newspaper, reading about this and being shocked by it. And, not really having any sense of what was an appropriate reaction to that. But in my lack of a career plan, I was taken in hand by my mentor at university, who was the senior tutor, who very kindly just sort of rang around the aid agencies and said, look, I've got this splendid chap called Aronson. Is there anything that he could usefully do for you? And Oxfam and Christian Aid and somebody else all said no, and Save the Children said, oh, yes, we're looking for relief workers. So I wasn't recruited on the telephone. I had to go and meet them at their headquarters, but very shortly after graduating, with absolutely no qualifications or relevant experience at all, I was on a plane to Lagos. I have to say, in the company of the gentleman on my left, who talked at me solidly from takeoff at Heathrow until we landed at Lagos Airport in the morning. So I'm going to let John do most of the talking now, actually, because that's what I've been doing for the last 50 years.
Okay, I mentioned I work at the University of Manchester. We have careers days often for our master's students, and the story you've both just described is something that would they'd probably be very jealous. Mike, could you tell us a little bit more about what you found when you got to Nigeria? Now, we have a habit of referring to Biafra when we talk about these histories in relation to aid, because a lot of the relief effort was focused on that landlocked enclave of Biafra. But of course, Nigeria is the wider frame of the Nigerian Civil War. So could you give us a sense of what you did with Save the Children there?
Okay, so it's important to say that at the outset in 1968, when Save the Children first got involved in the conflict, it attempted to work on both sides of the lines, as it were, and indeed it did have very briefly a relief team inside the enclave. But because the Nigerian army was advancing quite rapidly on that area, they were only actually able to stay for a couple of months before they had to evacuate. It was actually at a time when 2 Red Cross and 2 WCC workers were killed at a Kigwe hospital. So, that team was evacuated, and basically Save the Children was therefore left working on the Nigerian side. And much of the history about the relief operation, the Biafra relief operation, is about the relief into the enclave, the Uli airstrip and the night flights and all the rest of it. But actually there was a very substantial relief operation going on in those areas of the former Biafra that the Nigerian army had taken, and where most of the population were terrified of the threat of genocide and basically had run into the bush and were often completely cut off from any kind of assistance for a couple of months, and therefore when they were eventually persuaded to come out were in a dire state. And basically that's what the Save the Children teams did. We had teams who were led by a doctor like John. We would have 2 or 3 nurses in the team, and we would have 2 or 3 relief workers, people like myself. The doctors and the nurses were basically responsible for providing very basic healthcare. We operated very sort of crude sick bays. It's all we had because we're operating in an area where there's no infrastructure left at all. There's no skilled personnel at all. All able-bodied men have fled into the enclave. All middle-class people with cars have driven into the enclave. What's left are people who are really dispossessed and without any civil administration at all. So the only administration is really provided by the Nigerian army, which is obviously seen as the enemy, and by the aid agencies, of which Save the Children was the largest in that particular sector. So we were running these basic sick bays and clinics out in the villages, and we were also running a quite substantial feeding program. So my job basically was all to do with trucks and warehouses and food distributions, and that's what we did up until the time that the war ended in January 1970, when suddenly everything changed. Biafra had by then really become a forgotten crisis. There was very little aid coming in on our side. We had to make do. We had to be quite creative in terms of the devices we came up with. We might come back to that later. As soon as the war ended, it was a completely different story. Aid rushed in, and we moved into a completely different phase. At Save the Children actually took over most of the operation in the northern half of the remaining bit of Biafra from the churches, from Caritas, who were kicked out by the Nigerians at the end of the conflict.
Thank you. John, is there anything that you'd like to add to that picture from your own experience?
I think possibly your next question might make it easier for me to expand on it. But to raise one question at this point, because I think it's often missed in these discussions, is that, I was very wet behind the ears. Suddenly you are confronted with clinics which have 500 patients, food distributions where thousands of people turn up. Nobody around you has ever done this before. And it's only rather later on that I discovered, actually indirectly from the papers which relate to a group of Cambridge medical students and nutritionists who were sent out to try and save the lives of people in Auschwitz after the Second World War. The technology we were using at the time had not really developed since then, and the technology available then was so primitive. Now, we did the best we could. Some of it, I have to say, competent. Some of it I don't think I would medically ever do again. but that it opened up a series of questions about how you do things. Well, we simply didn't know the answers. Some were answered on the spot. If you remember it sounds very simple, but it needs some thought. The seating arrangements for feeding, 30,000 people, all on bamboo benches.
In the heat.
In the heat, fed up and down the lines. They soon put up awnings, and the rule was the first person who moves, the feeding is over. Yeah? Just, there's no other way of getting it out. So there was quite a lot of innovation on that front. But to raise this question of how the subject developed, save in that conflict, I don't think it added all that much technically, but there was a move. The Centers for Disease Control came in and started doing epidemiological surveys. They called themselves the Yellow Berets because if they got 6 weeks in Nigeria, they were exempted from the Vietnam draft. But they brought in concepts that some, myself, were quite ignorant of. We didn't do epidemiology as undergraduates. A much more developed subject now. The Quaker Relief Service, which started to innovate around child anthropometry, and particularly produced a thing called the quack stick, which some of you may be familiar with, a quick and easy way of assessing malnutrition. The feeling that innovation was possible. And just to mention that Save the Children actually indirectly played a role in this. I'll come on to it with the Sahel and Bangladesh, but it was a very open, very supportive organization that was, in a way, outward-looking in terms of expertise and improvement. But I'll get on to that perhaps later on the other.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, thank you. So before we come on to a bit more detail about the role of relief agencies, I wanted to come back to you, Sammy, for a sense of that bigger picture. We know that that relief effort is very prominent in the narratives that we tell about Biafra and Nigeria at the moment, but why has it become so prominent in our image of this conflict, and what does it leave out?
Yeah, well, so for the first year or so of the Nigerian Biafran civil war, it barely makes British news at all. And when Port Harcourt was captured in May '68, which I think you could argue is the most significant thing that happens in the war, because it makes Biafra completely landlocked. And the BBC running order, it came after an item about the Chelsea Flower Show. It just wasn't an issue. It just didn't come up in British media coverage at all. Michael Leitman went to Biafra-Nigeria. He was invited by Mark Press in late May, early June, and he was tipped off that there were hospitals, and in the hospitals you could find lots and lots of starving children. He went there with his photographer, and on June 10th, the Sun, he was a diplomatic editor for the Sun, and the Sun headline was "The Land of No Hope," and it was a huge splash in Britain. It's quite unimaginable today. Michael Leitman himself said when I interviewed him that the story would have made absolutely no sense without the pictures. They did the story, they waited till they got home, they didn't send it ahead. And it kind of gave birth to a new style of reporting, which was very visceral, very picture-heavy, and very focused on suffering. And it was very humanitarian, and within that, relief agencies had a very prominent place. Why did that become the story? Well, from a journalist perspective, you could cynically, the Nigerian Biafran War is a horrendously complicated thing about constitutional structures and pogroms and coups and counter-coups, personal rivalries between leaders who are barely in their 30s. When I interviewed Martin Bell, who was the BBC correspondent there, he said he was sent off to a country he had seldom heard of with a pocket packet full of press cuttings. The humanitarian story was, in a way, the easy story to tell because all you needed was just a picture. And you evoked a response that was far more significant than you'd ever get trying to explain the politics of it. But in a way that is too cynical. I mean, there was a humanitarian story to tell that was very significant. Journalists and everyone else were very shocked by what they found there, and they wanted it to stop, which is an odd position for a journalist to find themselves in. You're no longer just reporting what's happened, but you have almost a stake in it. And the relief agencies became the medium for that, for just stopping what they were seeing happening, because they found it so distressing. It's also at home. It's what audiences reacted to more than anything they reacted to in the year previously. You have to imagine. So people often talk about the Vietnam War as being a kind of watershed in media coverage of war. This is around about the same time. This is the first time that there is an international war that is beamed into British homes on telly every night, and that had a profound impact on people here. I made the program I made because of my granny, who had never in her life, she never went outside Britain. She, to put it generously, was not the most cosmopolitan of people. And she would say to my mum, you need to finish your plate because of the starving black babies in Biafra. It had a penetration that was completely unprecedented at the time. And that story, that focus on these starving black babies and sending something off to feed them became the story. What it missed out was the politics in a really profoundly political war. It's not just, as you mentioned, that is it the Biafran War, is it the Biafra-Nigerian War? The names of this, in a sense, already gives an indication of one's political leanings. The numbers involved, how many died, is also profoundly political. Nigeria, the last census Nigeria had was in 1963, because the issue about who lives where, what state get what to vote is so important. The aid effort itself became embroiled in the politics. As I'm sure you'll be able to talk about, the Biafrans profited from having planes fly into Uli because they charged them for money when they were desperately short of foreign exchange. And it also gave them cover to fly in arms, alternating flights with aid. So there was a whole politics around the war, which is eventually, needed to be resolved one way or the other. That was left out in the way it was covered, and the impression was given that there was just a humanitarian crisis, and you could send aid, and it would be resolved. And just a very quick example, the most egregious example I found of this in my research was there was a journalist called Susan Garth, who was also a humanitarian, who set up something called the Biafran Babies Appeal, after which she'd seen all the coverage. And she explained to the World at One, I think it was, she thought she could just go in there and take all the babies out and send them to British families who were longing to have them. But in her words, but oh my, it was so much more complicated than I thought.
Thank you. Before I come on to Marie-Luce, could I just ask you alluded very briefly then to Mark Press. Could you just give us a line or two about what they were doing?
So they were it was a press agency that was run by a Californian, I think it was called William Bernhardt, I think, who they were hired by the Biafran leadership, and they, after a while, developed a very sophisticated, for the time, press operation, and they sent out images, reports to I think 3,000 addresses and the 5 main wire agencies at the time. And they were, propagating a Biafran message that at first was about this is a legitimate nation that has the right to self-determination, and very quickly from 68 onwards turned into a story about there is a humanitarian disaster and a famine happening here. which there was, but also served the aims of the Biafran leadership.
Great, thank you for that. So Marie-Lise, you've worked primarily on other organisations in the Nigerian Civil War, the Red Cross movement, different parts, part of some of the UN agencies. Based on that work, what main challenges did the relief response present to those working there? And can you tell us a little bit more as well about how different perspectives, different organisational perspectives, and perhaps individual perspectives shaped how people understood what they were seeing?
I think the main, well, we have already touched many of the main challenges that the relief organization were facing, but maybe, of course, there was the political context that you just briefly explained, but the main question that the Nigerian government was imposing a blockade around Biafra, and that the relief organization could not access Biafra without breaching the blockade. And so, and so they had to decide whether to breach the blockade or to follow the condition of the Nigerian government, the condition that the Nigerian government imposed on the dispatching of relief to Biafra. So this was a first problem, and so they had to, the response the relief organization provided to this question was different depending on their sensibilities, if I can say that. And the first one who breached the blockade, of course, was the church organization, because many missionaries were based in Biafra, and they asked very much for relief, and they said how important it was to send relief to the region, and and the International Red Cross was much more cautious. But during the summer of 1968, because of the media pressure, it also decided to breach the blockade. That was one problem. Another one was, of course, the fact that these relief airlift, which were set up to go to Biafra, were instrumentalized by the Biafran authorities. So, as you just explained, the Biafran authorities got foreign currency, and they also got arms in some ways, thanks to, not exactly thanks, but to the relief airlift. And so many of the organizations, sometimes they have been, Biafra has been said that has been most of the time we have said that the relief organization have lost their, that they were naive, if I can say so, in Biafra. But actually, most of them, they were quite aware of what they were doing, and they knew that the Biafran government was also using the aid they were sending, but they thought that it was that they had to do it this way, otherwise many more people would die, and this is still a very controversial issue. As we have said also that the relief operation have prolonged the war. And maybe on another aspect, the logistics was also quite important issue and quite important problem for the relief organization. As I have said earlier, they did not have a very strong operational capacity at the time, and this became also a subject of dispute between the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Nigerian federal government, the problem of the logistic, because the Nigerian federal government, as the ICRC was responsible for the coordination of the relief organization in Nigeria. The Nigerian federal government thought that the ICRC was not efficient enough. So there was also an issue in this on these questions. And maybe a third point, which was also a big problem for the relief organization, was the violence with which they were confronted actually in Biafra. And I am also mentioning that because after the conflict, the French organization Médecins Sans Frontières was created, and one of the main arguments, at least in the story of Médecins Sans Frontières, was that the Red Cross did not speak out enough about the violence that was happening in the field and in Biafra. So I think, and especially on this question, there was quite a big difference between the people in the field who were confronted to this violence every day, almost every day, because of the Federal Army bombings and advance as well, and so the people in the field and the people in the headquarters.
Thank you. So some issues there around naivety or solidarity there in terms of how aid was unraveled in the conflict itself, some issues around coordination, and then a sort of inside or outsider view. So Mike, perhaps you could tell us, to what extent can we talk about a Save the Children position as an organisation, and how did it deal with these challenges?
So I think it's important to understand that there were effectively two separate relief operations here. Marie-Luce has been talking about the one inside Biafra, but as I explained before, Save the Children was really operating on the Nigerian side of the line. So our supply lines were all through Nigeria. They were very long, they were very tortuous, but we didn't have those political issues, if you like, with the Nigerian government, because we were somehow sort of breaching their own embargo on supplies into Biafra. The political issues that we face were rather different, I would suggest. And I'd just like to come back to this issue of neutrality, because at one point before I sort of got properly into the Save the Children archives in the Cadbury collection in the University of Birmingham, I thought that Save the Children had decided to stick with the Nigerian side, as it were. And that obviously would have called into question their neutrality. When I went to the archive and looked at it more closely, I realized that actually this was not a conscious choice. It was just born of necessity. For reasons we haven't got time to go into now, they just could not get people back inside Biafra once that first team had been forced to leave. However, there undoubtedly was an issue of neutrality, because if you are only working on one side of the lines in a conflict, you are bound to be perceived by the other side as being partial. And I don't think, Ojukwu, the Biafran leader, made it clear from the start that he wasn't going to accept any British aid at all, any official British aid. That's why Lord Hunt's fact-finding mission that went out in July 1968 was not allowed into Biafra. So, in a sense, Save the Children was condemned to being seen by the Biafrans as being on one side. And I have to say that, and this comes back to something Emily said this morning, in a way they didn't help that case, because they were very comfortable being seen to be very closely aligned with the British government. They accepted a lot of funding from the British government. There was one famous occasion where they even sent a refrigerator for drug supplies out to Lagos on a plane that was carrying the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, on a visit to Nigeria. And, they made publicity about that. It was seen as a good thing. Just one caveat, though. When the Save the Children initial response had nothing to do with the British government at all. Actually, the first Save the Children team that went to Nigeria was led by a member of Save the Children's Council, who was a doctor called Noel Moynihan. And it's absolutely astonishing that he from his practice in London, could have somehow gone to Nigeria with 3 or 4 colleagues and set up a relief team in a place called Ogu, which also tragically witnessed the death in a deliberate landmine explosion of 2 of his team fairly on, basically blown up by the Biafrans. So that was a very much a Save the Children response, in the tradition of responding to crisis. It was really only later that it suited the British government and it suited Save the Children to be in receipt of large quantities of British government funding. But I think inevitably that also sort of is an issue with regard to neutrality. The other thing to say, though, and the most important thing to say about the whole Biafran conflict, is that it was a complete failure of diplomacy and mediation. And yes, undoubtedly, the relief operation probably did contribute to the prolongation of the conflict for the reasons that Sami has referred to. The Biafrans demanded payment in hard currency for landing rights at Uli Airport for any local assistance that the aid agencies had. But I think that slightly misses the point, because the fact is nothing was being done to bring the two sides in the conflict together. There were all the attempts at mediation were ineffective. The Americans washed their hands of it. The British were conflicted because they felt they had to take the side of the federal government. The Organisation for African Unity viewed it as an internal dispute and was always on the side of the Nigerian government. So, there was nobody, at no stage did the two leaders, Ojukwu and Gowon, were they actually brought together around the table. There were really no meaningful negotiations to end this conflict. So the relief operation became the response of the international community. That was the real issue. And as Mrs. Ogata, the High Commissioner for Refugees, famously said some 40 years later, there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. And what we had in the case of the Biafra crisis was a humanitarian solution, in inverted commas, to a humanitarian problem. So the real thing for Save the Children and all the aid agencies, I think blaming them is sort of missing the point. They did what they felt they had to do, and some of them did it very well. I think we are proud of what we did. But it was it wasn't the thing that most needed to happen. A true humanitarian intervention in the Biafran War would have been some really muscular diplomacy to bring it to an end.
Thank you. A lot of the debates that followed out from this period in the French sort of aid circles are picking up that line of argument about the insufficiencies of aid. But actually, the East Pakistan or Bangladesh crisis is really important in that thinking as well. So, John, perhaps you could tell us about your experience in Bangladesh and in the Sahel afterwards, and what challenges you faced working there and Save the Children faced in those contexts as well.
Okay, again, I can be fairly brief. I mean, I was sent out to a camp near Calcutta, Salt Lake Camp. Salt Lake was a large marsh very close to the Hooghly River. In fact, it's said that Joseph Charnock, who founded modern Calcutta, was advised not to do it there because of the Salt Lake and the dangers it presented. Well, 250,000 were brought in and settled in this swamp, I went out to start and run a pediatric hospital. Very difficult, particularly in the rainy season when people were, literally propping their heads up on bricks so they didn't drown when they were sleeping. What is relevant to Save the Children? Well, how did I get there? The Indian government, you can imagine, wasn't too keen on having foreign organizations working. There were an enormous number of refugees up the border. Salt Lake was just the most prominent. Lady Alexandra Metcalfe, of whom you may have heard, Lord Curzon's daughter, a formidable presence. Curzon was not forgotten. He founded the state of Orissa, amongst other things. Pulled rank with the Indian government to get the Save the Children in, a thing I only realized rather later. What did Save the Children, as it were, make of it? Well, we provided an enormous amount of medical care, immunizations, and did everything that we could technically. But let me return to this technical thing. It's very difficult to explain just how primitive the approaches were at that time. If you've got 50, 100, 500 malnourished people, how do you deal with it? Was a fairly open question. Now, without going into how do you deal with it, which wouldn't be very interesting, it might be worth noting that the innovation that came in was a particular milk-based diet which had been developed by the Medical Research Council in Kampala at a unit of the Malago Hospital, itself an imperial gift to the supposedly Federation of East African States, called the Mwana Mujimo, which I think means, any Ugandans here? I think it means healthy baby or something. That was largely funded, that work, by the Save the Children. So this was a rather curious organization, well-meaning, yes, very heavily connected, extraordinarily connected. I think when Lady A went back a little while later, she was paraded around Calcutta in a white Mercedes, such was her status. And yet surprisingly open-minded and innovative. Yeah? Salt Lake gave rise to what I think is, I wrote this up afterwards and sent it to the Lancet and was quite horrified to discover they were actually going to publish it. I've never been so embarrassed in my life. I'd not imagined at that age that these things were actually accepted, but I thought there should be a record of it. I think it was probably the first modern paper. It's an accident, I'm not claiming credit here. How do you deal with 250,000 people living in a swamp? For me also it was an introduction to the fact that you have to be fairly careful what you say. I had been critical to a Calcutta journalist about the very fact that people had been put into this place. Sunday morning, a white ambassador car turned up. You will get in. You will go and see I think he was the Home Minister for West Bengal, in his pajamas on a Sunday morning, where seamen got a rollicking for speaking out of turn. And for me, it was a period of huge education about the dilemmas involved, about the way Save the Children worked, about the power plays, and about, frankly, the indifference to life that governments display when it's convenient to display it. The Sahel, to briefly touch on it, having got the taste for this and fallen in with a small group of scientists, I was the only proper, as a doctor, I'm a non-scientist, as it were. A small group of scientists an aeronautical engineer, a nutritionist, there was a mathematician, who had all, one way or another, been involved in relief operations. One who had got as far as Calcutta and been put back on the plane and sent home again. One, Julius Holt, who I worked with for a number of years, had been a Peace Corps, an anthropologist, had been a Peace Corps in Botswana during a drought, and couldn't quite work out what was going on. This small group set out to research disasters. It still exists, actually, in the ODI, the journal Disasters, was founded by that group. Now, it was one of a series of innovations, the Centre for Disaster Studies at the University of Louvain in Brussels, whose foundation was extraordinary, but I won't bore you with it. Ian Davis, who's at the Oxford Polytechnic, and a chap called Fred Cooney, who got himself killed in Chechnya, who were architects who took on shelter after disaster. A series of small groups loosely connected who addressed this question of, look, what actually is going on here and what should you do about it in professional terms? And that gave rise to actually quite a lot of output. And I think actually with inputs from Centres for Disease Control and established literature, some of which was the India office literature, set, as it were, a pattern of development which has continued to this day. Save the Children had a finger in quite a bit of it. So the Sahel, Julius and I just turned up at Save the Children and said, we want to go to the Sahel. It was the cause célèbre in New York. It was all over the newspapers, this huge drought that had been going on for 5 years, starvation, mayhem. Not a single investigation had been done the width of the Sahel. We turned up, we went to Burkina Faso, Upper Volta as was. begged a car off UNDP, headed off north. And again, it's very difficult these days to give the impression, but we were the only foreigners in the entire Sahel. There was a French anthropologist, but she was en congé. We tried to chase her down, and was anyway studying local attitudes to changes in the phases of the moon rather than drought. And we did the first survey and published it. Now, Save the Children very freely gave the money, supported us, out we went. And that raised a series of questions. Most people weren't starving. Some villages were getting by very nicely, thank you, after 5 years of drought. Raised a series of questions which wasn't until really the 1980s that they were fully answered. And they gave rise to work that I've been involved with ever since, and I'm still involved with, a lot of which took place at the Save the Children. So it wasn't just a bunch of old colonial fuddy-duddies, it was a bit more complicated than that.
Okay, thank you very much. I did tell the panelists that I would ask them to reflect on legacies, but unless someone wants to jump in particularly now, I think it might be better to open up to some questions in case people want to kind of come into the debate, and then perhaps I can prompt you to talk about those before we close off the session as a whole. Is that all right with everyone?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll take questions as before in small groups, 2s and 3s. And I apologise, I know some names, not all of them, so please do introduce yourself to the room, as I'm sure that would be the case for many. I could see there's one question up the back there, followed by one in the middle. Okay, 2 for now.
Okay, Mike's touched on this already, but did relief workers feel at the time that they were serving as a substitute for political action? And had the discourse of humanitarian alibi, band-aid, fig leaf, had that developed at that point in time?
And could you just tell us your name?
Oh, hi, I'm Matt. I'm an alumni at LSE.
Hi, I'm Adam in the humanitarian operations team. My question is, what did you do for fun?
For what, sorry?
What did you do for fun? We care a lot about wellness for aid workers and trying to avoid burnout. And we have lots of different techniques about how to look after ourselves so we don't get too stressed and we can continue to work well. But was that in your minds deployed at the time, or is that completely a new thing?
Okay. And do we have a third question just yet?
What did you do for fun?
Okay, over here at Emily, thanks.
Dear, couldn't read
I can take that one, John.
Hi, Emily Bourne. I'm sorry I skipped my Biafra slide earlier, but there's a question that I wanted to ask connected to it, which is when I was researching, one of the things that came out in some of the accounts from relief workers that I kind of chased down was the role of Nigerians in the relief effort, and part of that is local hospitals, which are kind of basically requisitioned by the relief effort, and their staff are working then on kind of relief, and some of that is volunteers from Western Nigeria who travel to the conflict zone. And I wondered if you had encountered or worked with any Nigerians who were involved in relief efforts.
Thank you. So we've got the role of Nigerians' local relief efforts, the question of burnout and stress alleviation for aid workers, and the political position of relief as a substitute. So Mike, it looks like...
Yeah, so thank you. 3 good questions. So, I mean, no, I think we definitely didn't regard ourselves as, at the time, as a substitute for political action. I think that awareness probably came from subsequent reflection. I think at the time, frankly, we all thought we were there to provide relief to those who were suffering. It was as simple and as straightforward as that. And, I think we felt that we managed to achieve quite a lot. In terms of the what did we do for fun, actually Save the Children was quite good in a sort of insisting on an R&R provision. There was a lovely place called the Obudu Cattle Ranch that was on the borders with Cameroon. It sounds very glamorous. It was actually sort of about an 8-hour drive on very bad roads and very damp, and the sun never shone when you got there. But I did ride my first horse ever there. I stayed on for about a minute, as I remember. They did make us go and take a break. But actually, what your question throws up is it was a very, very intense operating environment. We were all thrown together in a house, a small house that had been, previously occupied by a sort of middle-class family which had fled, and it was either us or the soldiers who were going to be living in the house. We didn't have any anything for amusement other than our own company, really. Actually, I just did want to mention one thing. John talked earlier about creativity. I mean, one of the most astonishing things I was asked to do, actually by John, was to be the team's blood technician. So in a lot of the kids, the most seriously ill kids in our sick bay were basically had low hemoglobin and needed a blood transfusion, but the only people who were available to give blood transfusions were ourselves. And so what would happen would be that one of the nurses would put a collecting kit on one member of the team, the blood would be collected, and we would then have to try to cross-match that blood with the blood of a child who needed a transfusion. And the way we did that was I had a little handheld centrifuge that was about this high, which was clipped onto the side of the kitchen table in the house in which we lived. And I sat there like this, whirring this thing round, and the things go out at the side and the cells separate. And on the basis of that, we actually, we matched blood and we did blood transfusions. Now, as John said, that is a very good example of something that you would absolutely not want to do if you were sort of basing it on a kind of solid scientific. But it's an example. I thought the story was worth telling. It's an example of the kind of intensity, if you like, of the environment in which we're working. So being able to get away from it was quite important. And I think that also links to Emily's question about the role of Nigerians. Because the fact of the matter is, in the areas in which we were working, as opposed to on the Biafran side, where actually the Biafran authorities said they didn't want any foreign medical personnel because they had them, plenty of sort of, Igbo doctors and nurses, no need for foreigners. But on the Nigerian side, it was completely different. As I said before, there was no infrastructure, there was nothing. Any building that had once been a hospital had been comprehensively looted. Generators, water pumps, everything would have been taken away by the army to sort of, for their own needs, in their own sort of temporary accommodation in the middle of this war zone. So, basically the only services that were being provided by expatriate relief teams like ours. And although the initial recce of the war zone back in 1967, I think, in early 1968, had been carried out by people from the long-term Save the Children program in Elisha in western Nigeria. There wasn't at least it wasn't really considered an option, and maybe Emily will know better than me from the archives why, but there was a complete separation really between that long-term program in the West and the relief program in the East. I mean, basically we were it. There was nothing else. We had to do the whole lot.
Marie-Lise, does that come up in your research?
Yeah, I just want to add something very briefly on the Nigerians, and also on because I have a slightly different perspective on the relief operation, also led by Nigerians on the Nigerian side, and the Red Cross, because when the conflict started, the Nigerian Red Cross was already a quite good national Red Cross organization and quite well organized, and so they play an important part during the conflict and in the relief operation, and in Biafra and in Nigeria as well, and especially after in the last month of the conflict, when the relief the media coverage became less important. So I think they had a very important role, maybe.
Could I just, maybe just to clarify, I'm talking about the period up until January 1970 when the war ended. And you're absolutely right. From the middle of 1969, after the ICRC were effectively removed from coordinating the overall operation, that passed to the National Rehabilitation Commission and the Nigerian Red Cross. So they progressively came much more into the overall management of the the relief operation on the Nigerian side, but the problem still was one of personnel. You know, it would have been really difficult actually to persuade people to come into what was still a war zone. I mean, our house was a mile from a front line that was pretty porous, and there was constant fear of, you know, of people coming across. So, I mean, there were real practical reasons why the relief operation, certainly in our sector, in the northern sector, was an expatriate affair up until the end of the war. Once the war ended, it was a different story.
Did you want to add something, Sammy, or no? Okay, so we can take another round of questions. Raise your hands. Okay, we've got purple here. Yep, 1, 2, 3.
Fiona from Save UK Humanitarian Department. I guess I'm wondering, in terms of decision making in the field, there's a lot of discussion at the moment around who takes decisions where within Save the Children. And I guess my question to those of you that were involved with it on behalf of Save the Children, what autonomy did you have in terms of taking decisions against what you were seeing and hearing and being able to do in the field, as opposed to be directed by the headquarters? So who had the biggest power? Was it you guys, or was it headquarters? And to what extent that meant you being accountable to Save the Children as a broader organisation?
Thank you.
Thanks. Lewis Sider, I'm a consultant, but I used to work for Save the Children. So Biafra in 1968 is thought of now as the sort of birth of the modern NGO movement in many ways. You've alluded to it already with the creation of MSF, Concern Worldwide. It's also a time of political change. We've got 68 in Paris. Can you describe to us the mood? You know, did it feel like a new moment? John, you've also talked about technological advances that start. So did it, you know, were you conscious of this beginning of a new time, decolonisation and the new NGO movement?
Hi, thank you for a really interesting discussion. My name is Malaika Giles and I'm currently studying here at LSE. My question is just about how much there was in the immediate aftermath of Biafra or Bangladesh, how much there was a formal lessons learned or review process or evaluation, and how that kind of fed into policy.
Thank you. So we have, where did decision-making power lie? Do you know when you're in a crucial moment? Do you have that consciousness of a kind of epochal change? And the final question that you just heard. So perhaps, John, do you want to start off?
Okay. Where did decision-making power lie? Well, I mean, the decisions that had to be made, I mean, other than the small, petty, day-to-day ones, really related to the progress of the war. So at certain points, there was a question of whether we could move south from where we were into newly, in quotes, liberated areas. And various exciting journeys were made, actually with the Nigerian army, to do that. The actual decisions at that level were entirely local. I can't think of anything being referred back to Save the Children in London. Okay. The second question was just to deal with it, because I think it came my way. Were we conscious of this being a new world order? I think I probably hadn't intellectualized it at that point. They say, if you can remember the 60s, Lewis, you probably weren't there. But there's no doubt that within a year or two or three, yeah, and certainly once I joined up with others in, as it were, reaction to the way things were being done by some agencies, yeah, very acutely aware of it. Because, I mean, I'm the generation that crossed with the end of empire. My father, well, he wasn't a proper imperialist, he was in commerce. Well, which meant he couldn't speak to the likes of this one, you know. No, I'm serious. It was very hierarchical, extraordinary business. And a good thing it ended. But my father's friends have been district commissioners and so on, you know. So I mean, I got a lot of that. We all danced around the Maypole for Empire Day. and got a propaganda mug or a pen or something to go with it. So I knew about that stuff. And so having actually the experience of it, yes, was to reject it and to try and form a completely new conception of where I stood with respect to newly independent countries and what the proper relationship was between outsiders and nationals, which I didn't get the freedom to do anything about it until I rejoined SAVE rather later, where we set out the rules. 81, I think, we set out all the rules for engagement.
So on that point, perhaps, of lessons learned, perhaps Mike here.
Well, just can I say a quick thing on to Fiona's question? I mean, just the practicalities of it. I mean, communication was just non-existent. So when I first went out in August 1969, John was already in a team at a place called Uturu. We opened, very shortly afterwards, we opened up a forward base at a village called Ahaba, which is about sort of, 12, 13 miles to the south, and, the journey to get there would take us an hour and a half, 2 hours if we were lucky. So you didn't get, and that road sort of was the front line, so you didn't go up and down that road more than you had to. So I think the reality was that we were, we could refer things back to Lagos by going up to Enugu and getting on a telephone, but that was it, really. Having said that, I mean, I did want to say one thing, which is, this about post-colonialism. I mean, yes, it was an acutely post-colonial adventure, really, and I wasn't aware of that at the time. I became aware of it subsequently, just how much that was the case. But actually, although Save the Children was in a very sort of post-colonial phase, it wasn't all bad. No. And as John said, they weren't just a bunch of post-colonial buffoons. I mean, and the reason I mention this in this context is the overseas director of the time was a man called Colonel Tony Hawkins. And in many ways he was a caricature of the sort of, the army officer from the colonial era. But actually, if you read his reports from his visits to the field, I think he went out about 4 times during the conflict. They're all in the archive. They are absolute sort of masterpieces of dispassionate analysis and sensible recommendation. So actually, we were guided by that. So from time to time, headquarters would come out, and the policy for the next phase of the operation would be set. So the immediate issue was, could we get into Biafra? Was there going to be a land corridor or not? Subsequently, the issue was, are we going to be able to come home? How quickly can we leave? And when it became apparent that we couldn't leave, we had to plan to stay. And then the one after that was, when the war ended, how much are we actually going to get involved in rehabilitation activities, given that that wasn't what we came here for? So all of that would have been sort of determined by probably a visit by the overseas director and a sort of discussions with the teams, an analysis that was then sort of taken back and submitted to the various sort of governance bodies back in London. So that sort of shaped the next phase of the operation, if you like. And on lessons learned, I mean, the Red Cross did huge lessons learned from Biafra. I'm not sure whether Save the Children did any formal lessons learned, but there is a very beautiful write-up in the archive by actually the press officer of the day, who just took a lot of the testimonies from the people who'd worked there over the period of the relief operation and sort of wrote it up in about a 40-page piece. And that's worth reading, even if it's not a formal lessons learned exercise.
Yeah, and to give you just a very quick flavour of what it was like, the isolation of these places, one for Pete Smith. We were working in Ogu, quite difficult, quite isolated, when a European turned up in a Land Rover, and who are you? I've come to look at the accounts. And there was this awful moment. You mean we have to keep accounts? And so I suggested to him he must be tired after his journey. Perhaps he'd like to go lie down. And while he was lying down, the accounts were generated. Everybody flew around, getting signatures, thumbprints, anything you like on scraps of paper. And the accounts finished cash in tin. So much. And he was quite relaxed about this. It was a different thing.
Before we take the next lot of questions, can I just bring you in, Sammy? You interviewed some survivors of the conflict for your program. So can you give us a sense of what they remembered as the legacies of the period? They're all quite young, at least the ones that are featured in the program. So how did people who lived through it actually talk about the significance of this period for them?
Yeah, well, obviously for all of them, it was completely formative. One of them was a child soldier in Biafra who fought for the Biafran army until it all ended, and has basically been wrestling with that the rest of his life. Others I spoke to were younger than that. They were just children when it happened. The one that stuck with me most was a man called Onyekachi Wambu, who now lives in London. And he was the son of a fairly well-off Nigerian and Biafran family. His dad looked after a refugee camp in Biafra. His dad was then killed right at the end of the war. And I suppose his experience showed both the kind of, there were some very nice moments about what it was that aid meant to him. I mean, he said that whenever he sees Pear's soap, it immediately transforms him back to this moment that when something had made it through the blockade and they'd been making their own soap for months and it was scratchy and horrible, and then there was this Pear's soap. And he said every time he smells it, it brings him back to how much it meant to him. He then, when the war ended, and his father had died, he moved with his mum to London, and the first he remembers seeing the Nigerian Biafran War being covered on, I think maybe I can't remember what channel it was on. He said it was the first time he'd ever seen Igbo on TV, so he was completely entranced, and he realised as he started to watch it, the Igbo was just kind of in the background, and the whole story was about the aid workers who were there. And he said he was completely furious because, and this isn't to belittle the effort of aid workers, but in a nation of, well, it was a nation of 8 million people in a country the size of Ireland or half of it, most of the solidarity, most of the acts of aid were from Biafrans themselves. He said that there were 16 people living in his house. The people they fed when they had so little themselves. He felt all of this was effaced by the way that it was covered. These things don't have to go against each other. You can have an aid effort and also have Biafran solidarity, and those things can dovetail. It's just, and I don't at all blame aid workers, I blame my own profession for the way it covers these things. He then went on to become a journalist because of that. He made documentaries for Channel 4, and he said basically his whole career was then trying to kind of give the voice back to the people who were the recipients of aid and people who were the victims of war, because he said really for 30 years in the British media you didn't hear an African speak.
Okay, so we'll take a few more questions. I'm going to look this direction. We've got two up the front. And okay, and take you at the front. Okay, so front, just here, right at the front here. Please do introduce yourself as well.
Yes. My name is Justyna Jarząbska. I'm from Poland. My question is with regard to conflict sensitivity and the principle do not harm in the humanitarian cooperation. I just wonder, like, what was your strategy, whether there was any strategy, and if yes, like, how did your preparation look like when going for the mission, humanitarian mission, and taking responsibility for this principle, like how the cooperation between different organizations look like, again, like just to implement this international principle. I hope, like, I mean, was I understood?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And Steve?
Stephen MacDonald, ex-Save the Children UK, now Save the Children Australia and Centre for Humanitarian Leadership. Given the importance of this time period in the history of the organisation and in the history of humanitarianism, I'm curious as to whether or not there was a sense of the Save the Children movement coming together at this time, particularly given the rapid proliferation of Save the Children members across Europe, North America and other parts of the Commonwealth, and whether there was more of a solidarity starting to come together at this time.
Thank you. I said in the yellow here at the front.
Hi, I'm Anna Save the Children. Sammy was talking earlier about how previously aid agencies would communicate with the British public and how they would often portray images of starving children but not focus on the political nature of the conflict. I wondered if any of you guys had reflections on whether we've changed as a sector in that sense, whether there's more we could do, or whether that's just sort of the realities of the current sector.
Okay. Will you forgive me if I give you a bumper round of questions in this go? There are a few more hands. I don't want to run out of time. So I saw Giuliano down here. I don't know your name, I'm sorry. And well, maybe we'll leave it there. We'll try to squeeze one more in. Apologies at the back. So who has the microphone? Right there. Okay, yeah. Right here is fine. Thank you.
My name is Regina Keith. I'm ex-Save the Children. But I just want to make a comment from before I was Save the Children. So I spent about 8 years in Nigeria in the 80s. I think just the question or just the context is I went there in the 80s. I was very privileged to go with Ransom Kuti. And there was a lot of other political things going on that was nothing to do with Save the Children and other things. So there was a very big divide between what was happening with some very qualified health workers, and I know he wanted to try and get the involvement of others in there. So I think sometimes when we're making this assessment, to not leave out that. And the second thing I want to say is that when I did about a 3-year up in northern Nigeria, qualitative assessment with people, and some of the memories, as Mike was saying, from older men and stuff about what happened during the Biafra and just afterwards, it was very interesting because their lives afterwards was actually very different, and it was very difficult for them because they had no food, they had, even after the Biafra. So they found that their reality of when people were coming in, they were getting access to food, they were getting access, and then the 2, 3, up to 7 to 10 years in some of the places, literally no health care, no water, no anything. And so I think sometimes when we're giving these discourses about that, I mean, as I said about the political discourse, everybody, when I was on the ground, and I wasn't with Save the Children those days, literally everybody just worked together as much as possible because there was nothing. There was no pens, no books, nothing. There was nothing, and the hospitals were empty. And those classes were empty. There was no teachers, there was nothing. It was just desert. So I just think sometimes when we're giving these discussions, and I know it's great, and I love that everyone's here, but the reality on the ground is, as John was saying, and this is up until recently, because we went out of it during the other wars in the 80s, and Save the Children then reopened in my old house in the 80s back in Nigeria. But in the interim period, there was nothing again. And so I think sometimes when we come back to it, and there was a lot of Nigerian nurses and health workers that came to work with us, they sat there, they were trained, qualified people, but they had no drugs. And in fact, many of them said to me during the time I was there, like they were speaking English, one of them had been a soldier, one of them had been also, there was a lot of nurses, they had all been trained. They had no drugs, they just felt so disempowered that they had all this education, all this ability, and then it was going nowhere. So I guess my comment and question is, when we're doing this discourse, that we should always remember that the voices that are not always here just now are not always being listened to.
Thank you. And final one in this round from Giuliano.
Thanks. Emily said this morning that, well, she talked about the predominance of military men in Save the Children after the Second World War. And Mike, you mentioned that a colonel was still in charge at this point. But you and John were part of the first generation in this new age of technicians, so to speak. However, it was still predominantly men working for Save the Children. And I wanted to see how you thought that was reflected in your aid work. So how was your assistance itself gendered?
Okay. So we have questions around the conflict sensitivity work of the organizations. How did they cooperate to that? Were there considerations of do no harm at the time? focused on Save the Children itself? Was there a kind of coalescing of organizational identity here? What were the stakes of the organization? The gendered nature of that operational response, and then two questions that take us a bit out of that organizational frame, thinking about kind of ethics of portrayals and including ethics of how we think about the periods. Obviously, you know, the world doesn't stop in January 1970, which is a little bit the way that my questions to you were framed in some of this panel. So I think because of the mix of things, I'll just work down the line, if that's all right. Please comment when you feel you have something to add. So Mike, we'll start with you.
There's an awful lot of issues in those questions, I have to say. I mean, I think the honest answer on conflict sensitivity and do no harm is probably not. You know, I don't think there would have been any serious analysis. It would have been a humanitarian response. It may have been more true, I think, of the relief operation inside Biafra, where, you know, as Marie-Luce has explained, the issues around the relationship between the relief operation and the conflict were much more acute. So maybe you might want to add to that. I mean, the interesting one on the Save the Children movement, so it's interesting that after Save the Children UK, or the Save the Children Fund as we were, had to leave the enclave and could no longer work inside Biafra, what it did was channel some support through the International Union for Child Welfare to other Save the Children organisations that had a presence inside Biafra. So there was a limited amount of nutrition work, for example, that was funded by Save the Children through the IUCW. There's another rather less noble story, which I don't think has ever been told, so you're hearing it here first, folks, which was rivalry between Save the Children UK and the IUCW, particularly over the issue of the repatriation and resettlement of the children who had been evacuated out of the enclave to Gabon and the Ivory Coast during the conflict. And there was a huge program of resettlement, family tracing, identification, resettlement, which Save the Children UK was actually quite keen to be in the lead on and ended up being in the lead on. But there was a bit of an issue there as to whether it was going to be a UK operation or whether it was going to be a more kind of global Save the Children operation. So I think it's true that the kind of the stirring of international cooperation that was visible at the time of the Biafra thing. I sort of missed the. I mean, sorry, I missed the question about. I just wrote down political reflection. I've forgotten what the question was. But on Giuliano's point, I mean, which is a really important point. I mean, John might want to say more from his perspective as a doctor, because we did have women doctors as well as men doctors. Obviously, we had a lot of women nurses. I don't think there were any male nurses. I can't remember. The relief workers were all men. So, yes, I would say it was still a fairly gendered approach, really. You know, the traditional roles were assigned according to sort of gender stereotypes, but not completely. So, you know, it's a picture that certainly would look very different today.
Marie-Luce?
Yeah, again, I'm not quite sure where to begin. I mean, one which, if I got the question right, was the conditions after the war, presumably when the relief operation itself ended. Things went back, as it were, to normal. And for me, it was a slightly formative moment in that medical workers started coming back into the East and looking for the wherewithal to work. And I handed out quite a lot of drugs, but in the full knowledge that this couldn't go on for long. Yeah? The civil administration would have to come back in at some point. Exactly what happened, well, I imagine it's as was described, but for me a slightly extraordinary moment was the first African I ever worked with. A poor young man from a village north of Ogu, who doesn't know his age, 14, 15, but spoke impeccable English, was my translator. He went on to education and get a USAID scholarship and re-emerged in my life a couple of years ago as a consultant physician at the Lagos University Hospital. And he describes conditions in his village, which I went to all those years ago, as frankly worse than they were before the war. And as to communications, there is no mobile signal, nothing has been done. You know? And it really is a dilemma. I think one that isn't reflected on enough, that relief operations can bring a period of abundance, you know? And then they arbitrarily come to an end. Foreigners come in, suddenly become aware of, for example, diseases which are historically simply not treated. You know? They treat it, they go away, it stops. It can be a very arbitrary intervention if it's not well judged.
And Sammy, perhaps you could speak to the portrayals, the question of the imagery, and thinking perhaps about the legacies question I was going to ask you about the media.
I mean, I just said my criticism mostly from Biafra-Nigeria is of the media and not necessarily of how the charities, humanitarian organizations portrayed things. There's a funding imperative, and I understand that certain images are much more likely to get funding than others. That's the job of humanitarians as I see it from the outside. From a journalist perspective, I think your job is to at least communicate a little bit about what is actually going on. Whether it's changed, yes, undoubtedly, through a kind of nadir of the 1980s with the Michael Burke's report from Ethiopia, which is 7 minutes of children crying more or less, at the end of which you have literally no idea why there's a famine in Ethiopia. It undoubtedly had an effect, Biafra, in the way that conflicts in Africa would be framed, both in the media and in charities. I often think, you know, the Great Leap Forward was 10 years before Biafra and killed 50 million people, perhaps. There's barely an image of it. I imagine you'd like to think how people would think of China in a different way if there had been that access, if there had been that technology at the time. Biafra killed maybe 500,000, maybe 3 million people. We don't really know. But undoubtedly, just the timing of it had an enormous impact. It had a Blue Peter appeal that year that they asked for 144,000 parcels of wool and cotton, and British children sent 1 million and 144,000. As a whole generation of children whose first interaction with Africa was sending things to kind of resolve a situation and hope that it would be done immediately. I think things have improved since. I think the media is still to blame. I think charities still can perpetuate not particularly helpful images. But we're guilty too. Every day when I at work now, I work for the Today program. If there's a story about Yemen, there's a kind of formula you follow, which is you talk to an aid worker and who explains to you what's happening on the ground and how awful it is. Whether we've ever explained to our audience who the Houthis are, I'm not entirely sure. It's just there's a kind of formula that exists, and we know that it's the one that's most going to attract listeners, which is also part of our imperative. But I do think things are improving. I think that question that Onyekachi had touched on about whether Africans speak for themselves in the media has improved, and I'll give you the credit as well that I know it's improved a lot in humanitarian organizations.
Thank you. I said I was going to take a couple more questions, but I'm desperately running down the clock, and we are about to hear about an exhibition that will pick up some of those questions of imagery. So with the permission of the panel and of the room, I will close it there. Please join me in thanking the speakers for a really fascinating